Inside the vessel's main high-voltage switchboard, among dozens of signal wires, ran a single wire, designated Wire 1. Wire 1 carried a label band, a small silicone sheath heat-shrunk around the wire to identify its terminal block connection. That band covered the full length of the ferrule's blue insulated collar, adding just enough thickness to prevent the wire from seating completely in its terminal block. It was a tolerance measured in fractions of a millimeter, but it was enough. Wire 1 became electrically disconnected from its terminal block. A quiet failure inside a sealed cabinet, invisible to any crew member on watch. Before a single alarm sounded, the conditions for failure were already built into the ship. The Dali was making 8.9 knots through restricted waters when everything that followed was set in motion. What happened next was not a matter of dramatic sparks or catastrophic equipment failure. It was a chain reaction, each link forged long before this voyage began. Below decks, the fuel system that fed diesel generators 3 and 4 was not the system designed for that purpose. The original supply and booster pumps, built with automatic restart capability, sat idle. In their place, the crew relied on the flushing pump, a piece of equipment designed for clearing fuel lines during maintenance, now pressed into service as the primary fuel supply for DG3 and DG4. Both the current chief engineer and his predecessor had found the vessel configured this way when they came aboard. Neither changed it. The flushing pump had one critical limitation that set it apart from the equipment it replaced. It could not restart itself. If power was lost and then restored, the designed supply and booster pumps would resume automatically. The flushing pump would simply stop and wait for a human hand. In normal conditions, that distinction might have been manageable. What the crew was about to face were not normal conditions. The pump at the center of this failure was never meant to be there. The flushing pump was a maintenance device designed to clear fuel oil from piping, not to sustain the pressure demands of running diesel generators. Yet aboard this vessel, it had been pressed into service as the primary fuel supply for DG3 and DG4, a role it was never engineered to fill. The pumps the ship's designers had specified for that duty, the supply and booster pumps, sat unused. That substitution carried a consequence that would only become visible in a crisis. The design-intended supply and booster pumps were built with a critical safeguard. If power was lost and then restored, they would restart automatically. The flushing pump had no such capability. When the low-voltage blackout cut electrical supply, the flushing pump stopped. And when power returned, it stayed stopped. To bring it back, a crew member would have had to leave the engine control room, descend 2 decks in near total darkness with only a flashlight, and restart the pump by hand at the purifier room. In a functioning system, that gap between electrical restoration and mechanical readiness would not matter. Here, it was the difference between recovery and collapse. In the early hours of March 26, 2024, the container ship Dali was moving through the Patapsco River at 8.9 knots, her bow roughly 3,200 feet from the Francis Scott Key Bridge. Inside the main switchboard, among dozens of signal wires routed to terminal blocks, one connection had been compromised. Not by age, not by corrosion, but by the way a wire label band had been improperly installed. Wire 1 became electrically disconnected from its terminal block. That disconnection triggered the opening of the HR1 breaker, which interrupted power to the step-down transformer linking the high-voltage bus to the low-voltage bus. At 1:25 seconds, a low-voltage blackout swept through the vessel. A single misplaced piece of banding material had severed the electrical chain that held the ship's systems together. What followed would not be a story of restoring power. It would be a story of everything that power alone could not restore. At 1:25 in the morning, the low-voltage electrical bus went dark. The opening of a single breaker had severed power to the step-down transformer, and the blackout cascaded instantly through the ship's low-voltage systems. Among the systems that fell silent was the fuel oil flushing pump, the pump that had been pressed into service to supply pressurized fuel to diesel generators 3 and 4. In the engine control room, the crew moved immediately. They had to. Because the high-voltage breakers had been left in manual control mode, no automatic restoration was possible. A crew member had to physically close the breakers by hand to bring power back. That decision cost time the vessel could not spare. In automatic mode, the blackout might have lasted 10 seconds. In manual mode, it stretched to 58. While the crew worked to close the breakers, the emergency diesel generator was starting on its own. But it too needed time. 70 seconds elapsed before it connected to the emergency bus. When the breakers finally closed, voltage returned to the low-voltage bus. From the panels in the engine control room, it may have looked like a recovery. It was not. The flushing pump had no automatic restart capability. Restoring electrical power did not restart it. Fuel pressure to diesel generators 3 and 4 remained at 0. The distinction between electrical restoration and mechanical readiness is precise. And in this moment, it was absolute. Voltage had returned. Fuel had not. Without fuel pressure, diesel generators 3 and 4 could not run. The main engine stayed offline for the remainder of the voyage. The emergency bus, which had briefly held, lost power moments later. The engine control room went dark a second time. The crew now faced a choice that the design of the system had quietly made impossible to execute in time. Leave the engine control room in darkness, descend 2 decks, and manually restart a pump that was never built to run in this role. Or remain where they were and accept that propulsion was gone. The cascading failure had not been electrical. Every breaker that could be closed had been closed. The gap that defeated recovery was mechanical. A pump without the ability to restart itself. The crew had closed the breakers. Voltage had returned. But the generators remained silent. The flushing pump, which had been configured as the primary fuel service pump for diesel generators 3 and 4, had no automatic restart capability. This was the critical distinction. The design-intended supply and booster pumps would have restarted on their own once power was restored, but those pumps were not in use. The substitute pump required a human hand. To provide that hand, a crew member would have to leave the engine control room on the second deck, descend 2 levels in near total darkness with only a flashlight, and reach the purifier room on the 4th deck to restart the pump locally. 2 decks, darkness, a vessel drifting toward a bridge. The gap between electrical restoration and mechanical readiness had become the length of a stairwell and the width of a recovery window that was already closing. By the time the flushing pump could be restarted, the window for recovery had already closed. At 1:29 in the morning on March 26, 2024, the Dali struck Pier 17, the southern pier supporting the central span of the Francis Scott Key Bridge. The vessel's estimated impact force exceeded 4 times the lateral load the pier was designed to withstand. 13 seconds after the initial impact, Pier 17 collapsed. A worker on the bridge later described hearing what sounded like crumbling thunder, and then ran. Spans fell into the Patapsco River. Others came down directly onto the bow and forward container bays of the vessel itself. A 7-person road maintenance crew had been on the bridge that night. 6 of them died. 1 worker survived, with serious injuries. The cascading failure that began with a single disconnected wire that disabled a pump, that starved 2 generators of fuel, that left a crew unable to restart their engines, ended here. Restoring electrical power and restoring mechanical readiness are not the same thing. The crew would learn that distinction at the worst possible moment. The flushing pump had never been designed for continuous fuel supply. It was a maintenance tool, built to flush fuel lines, not to feed running generators. Yet when the low-voltage blackout struck, it was precisely this pump that had been supplying pressurized fuel to diesel generators DG3 and DG4. Unlike the supply and booster pumps purpose-built for that role, the flushing pump carried no redundancy. There was no backup waiting in the wings. When the crew closed breakers and restored supply voltage to the switchboard, the lights came back, the instruments came back, but pressure did not come back. The flushing pump was not configured to restart automatically following a loss of power. It simply sat idle, waiting for a manual command that no one could yet deliver. Fuel pressure remained at 0. DG3 and DG4 stayed inert. The emergency bus, dependent on generators that could not run without fuel, remained unpowered. This is the hidden gap in equipment substitution. A device pressed into service beyond its design purpose carries only the capabilities it was built with. Automatic restart was never one of them. In a narrow recovery window, the difference between a pump that restarts itself and one that does not is the difference between options and none.